Some say dogs can hear things we never will. But that night, Rex wasn't just listening. He was answering something calling from the dark. The road stretched empty for miles, a thin ribbon of cracked asphalt cutting through a frozen valley where the wind moved like a quiet whisper between the trees, and Daniel Mercer drove slowly, one hand on the wheel, the other resting on Rex's back as the old truck rattled against the cold. At 40 years old, Daniel carried himself like a man who had learned to survive silence, his broad shoulders stiff beneath a worn flannel jacket, his eyes scanning the road not out of curiosity, but habit, the kind built from years of expecting something to go wrong. Rex sat upright in the passenger seat, ears high, amber eyes fixed on the darkness ahead, his body still in a way that wasn't calm, but focused, as if he could feel something just beyond the edge of sight. The temperature had dropped below 20 degrees, and frost clung to the edges of the windshield like fragile glass. The world outside reduced to shadows and pale moonlight, but inside the truck, there was a quiet rhythm, the hum of the engine, the slow rise and fall of Daniel's breath, the kind of silence that felt almost peaceful until it wasn't. Without warning, Rex stiffened, a low sound rising in his throat, not a bark, not quite a growl, but something deeper, something that made Daniel's grip tighten slightly on the wheel. "What is it, boy?" he muttered, his voice rough but steady, though his eyes had already shifted, scanning the roadside. Rex didn't look at him, didn't move, his gaze locked forward as if something invisible had just stepped into their path. And then suddenly, he barked once, sharp and urgent, a sound that cut through the cold like a crack in ice. Daniel slowed the truck instinctively, heart beating a little faster, not out of fear, but recognition, because Rex never barked without reason. The headlights swept across the empty road, illuminating nothing but drifting snow and skeletal trees. Yet the dog's tension only grew, his body leaning forward, paws pressing against the dashboard as if he was ready to leap. Then, just as the truck rolled to a near stop, Rex turned his head slightly, not toward the road, but toward the darkness beyond it, ears twitching, listening. And in that same breath, Daniel heard it too, faint and fragile, carried by the wind, a sound so small it could have been mistaken for the night itself, except it wasn't. It was a voice. A single cry, distant, trembling, and almost gone. Daniel didn't hesitate. He killed the engine, the sudden silence rushing in like a held breath finally released, and before the keys stopped swinging, Rex was already at the door, claws scraping against the handle, urgency written in every movement. Daniel pushed the door open, boots crunching into the snow as the cold air hit him sharp and clean, and for a moment, he stood there, listening, the world holding still around him. Somewhere out there, beyond the reach of light, something had called for help. And somehow, Rex had heard it first. Maybe some things don't wait to be found. Maybe they choose who finds them. The snow swallowed sound as soon as Daniel stepped off the road, each breath turning into a pale cloud that drifted away into the dark, and Rex moved ahead without hesitation, his body low and precise, weaving between frozen branches as if following a path only he could see, his paws pressing softly into the powder, yet never slowing, never questioning. And Daniel followed close behind, boots sinking several inches with every step, the cold biting through the seams of his jacket, but barely, registering against the growing sense that something out there was waiting for them, something fragile and running out of time. The cry came again, weaker now, carried across the still air like a thread about to snap, and Daniel turned his head sharply, locking onto the direction as Rex surged forward, pushing through a narrow break in the trees where the wind had carved a shallow drift, revealing a small clearing half hidden beneath shadow. That was where he saw her. She lay against the base of a fallen pine, its heavy trunk angled across the ground, as if it had simply given up under the weight of winter, and though the branches cushioned part of the fall, it had pinned her enough to trap her in place, her small frame barely visible beneath layers of wool and frost, her breath thin and uneven but still there. For a brief moment, Daniel did not move, not out of fear, but because something about the scene felt strangely still, like a photograph that had been waiting to be found, and then training took over, steady and automatic, the way it always had when hesitation could cost too much. He dropped to one knee beside her, brushing snow away with gloved hands, his voice low and calm as he spoke. telling her she was going to be all right even though he had no way of knowing yet. And Rex circled once before planting himself near the trunk, muscles tensing as if he understood what was needed before Daniel said a word. The wood was solid, frozen hard, heavier than it looked, but Daniel adjusted his footing, boots digging deep for leverage. And with a slow, controlled effort, he began to lift just enough to ease the pressure, not forcing it, not rushing, just holding steady while Rex leaned in close. His body pressed near Daniel's leg, as if anchoring him to the ground itself. The woman stirred slightly, a faint breath catching in her throat, and Daniel shifted the weight just enough for her to move, guiding her gently free until the pressure released, and she could draw in a deeper breath, the sound of it fragile but real. He eased the trunk back down carefully, making sure it would not shift again, then turned fully to her, brushing frost from her coat, his hands steady despite the cold that had settled deep into his fingers. Her eyes opened slowly, pale blue catching what little light filtered through the trees, and for a moment she did not look at Daniel at all. She looked at Rex. The dog stood still, ears forward, gaze steady, and something passed between them that Daniel could not explain, something quiet and certain. Then she spoke, her voice barely more than a whisper carried on the cold air, and though it was weak, it held a calm that did not belong to someone who had just been rescued. "He found you," she said softly, her eyes still on the dog. "Just like I prayed." Daniel frowned slightly, not understanding, but before he could respond, the wind shifted through the trees, carrying with it a strange stillness that seemed to settle over the clearing, as if whatever had called them here had been waiting for this exact moment to be complete. Sometimes help arrives because someone asks for it, and sometimes it arrives because something greater already decided who would answer. Daniel did not ask questions right away because something in the woman's voice told him this was not a moment meant for answers, but for movement, and the cold was already beginning to settle deeper into her bones. So he slipped one arm carefully beneath her shoulders and helped her sit upright, while Rex remained close. His body angled slightly toward the trees, as if still listening for something beyond them, his ears twitching at sounds too distant for human senses to catch. The woman's breath steadied little by little, each inhale longer than the last, and though her hands trembled slightly, there was a quiet composure in the way she gathered herself, as if she had expected this night to come, even if she had not known how. "Can you stand?" Daniel asked gently, his voice low and even, the same tone he had used in situations where panic needed to be replaced with calm, and she nodded faintly, placing her gloved hand against his arm as he helped her to her feet, her weight light but unsteady. The fallen tree loomed behind them, its branches creaking softly as the wind passed through, and for a brief second Daniel glanced at it again, not because of what it was, but because of the strange feeling that it had not been entirely chance that brought it down at that exact moment, in that exact place. Rex stepped forward once they were upright, circling the woman slowly before stopping beside her, his head lifting just enough to meet her gaze again, and she offered him a faint smile, the kind that carried more recognition than surprise. "You knew where to go," she murmured, her voice still thin but steadying, and Rex's tail moved once, slow and deliberate, as if acknowledging something unseen between them. Daniel adjusted his grip and began guiding her back toward the road, each step careful across the uneven snow, his boots breaking a path while hers followed. In the shallow prints he left behind, and the forest seemed quieter now, the earlier tension fading into a stillness that felt almost watchful. The truck came into view between the trees, its metal frame catching the pale light like a distant shelter, and when they reached it, Daniel opened the passenger door and helped her inside, brushing snow from the seat before easing her down gently. Rex jumped in after her without being told, settling close at her feet rather than returning to his usual spot, his presence steady and protective in a way that needed no explanation. Daniel walked around to the driver's side, pausing for just a moment with his hand on the door handle as he looked back toward the dark stretch of woods they had just left, the silence there now complete, as if nothing had ever happened at all. When he climbed inside and started the engine, the truck rumbled to life, its warmth slowly pushing back the cold that had followed them in, and for a few seconds none of them spoke, the only sound the low hum of the heater and the faint ticking of metal adjusting to heat. Then the woman turned her head slightly, her eyes no longer distant but clear, and this time she looked at Daniel. "My name is Margaret Hale," she said softly, her voice carrying a quiet strength that had not been there before. "And I believe you were meant to find me tonight." Daniel glanced at her, his brow tightening just a fraction, not in disbelief, but in the way a man reacts when something feels too precise to ignore, and before he could respond, Rex shifted again, his ears lifting toward the dashboard, as if he had caught another signal hidden beneath the ordinary sounds of the night. Outside, the wind moved across the road in a slow whisper, tracing patterns no one could see, and inside the truck, something unspoken settled between them, something that felt less like coincidence and more like the beginning of a path that had already been chosen long before any of them stepped onto it. Sometimes the road you think you are driving is not the one you are actually on. The truck moved slowly along the narrow road, its headlights carving a pale path through the darkness as snow drifted lightly across the asphalt, and inside, the warmth began to settle into the space between them, softening the edges of the cold that still clung to their clothes. Yet something else lingered, something quieter and harder to name. Margaret Hale sat with her hands folded gently in her lap, her breathing now steady, her posture upright in a way that suggested not weakness but endurance, as if she had spent a lifetime learning how to remain calm even when the world shifted beneath her feet. Rex stayed close to her boots, his body relaxed but not at ease, his ears flicking at intervals, responding to sounds that seemed to come and go without pattern, and every so often he would lift his head slightly, his gaze drifting toward the windshield as though he expected something to appear just beyond the reach of the headlights. Daniel kept his eyes on the road, but his attention was divided, part of him still in the forest, replaying the moment he had heard the cry, the way it had arrived just after Rex reacted, the way everything had aligned too precisely to dismiss. "You said you were meant to be found," he said finally, his voice low, not challenging, but searching, as if the words themselves carried weight he was not ready to fully accept. Margaret did not answer right away. She turned her gaze toward the window, watching the dark shapes of trees slide past, their outlines bending gently with the wind, and when she spoke, her voice carried a softness that felt older than the night itself. "There are moments," she said, "when the world does not move randomly, when things are placed exactly where they need to be, even if we do not understand why." Daniel exhaled slowly, his breath fogging faintly in the cold air that still lingered near the glass. And though he had heard words like that before, they had always come from places he had learned to avoid, places that spoke in certainty about things he had only ever experienced as chaos. "And you believe tonight was one of those moments?" he asked. Margaret's lips curved into a faint smile, not amused, but knowing. "I do not believe," she replied gently. "I have been waiting." The words settled into the cab of the truck with a quiet finality, and for a moment, the only sound was the low hum of the engine and the soft rhythm of the heater pushing warm air through the vents. But then Rex shifted again, his body tensing slightly as he lifted his head toward the dashboard, his ears locking forward with sudden focus. Daniel noticed immediately. He always did. "What is it?" he murmured, glancing briefly at the dog before returning his eyes to the road. Rex did not bark this time. He simply listened, his gaze fixed ahead, and then, slowly, he lowered his head again, but not in relaxation, in recognition, as if whatever he had sensed had already passed through them unnoticed. Margaret reached down carefully, her hand resting lightly against the dog's back, and Rex did not pull away. Instead, he stilled completely, accepting the touch as though it belonged there. "He hears it," she said softly, almost to herself. "The things that move between moments." Daniel tightened his grip on the steering wheel just slightly, his jaw setting as he processed the words, not rejecting them, but not embracing them either, because somewhere deep inside, there was a part of him that had learned to trust the dog more than his own instincts. The road curved gently ahead, leading them toward a faint glow in the distance, the outline of a house emerging slowly against the dark horizon, its windows lit with a warm amber light that seemed almost out of place in the cold stillness of the night. As they approached, the wind shifted again, brushing softly against the truck like a passing breath, and something about the way the light flickered behind the glass gave the impression that the house was not just waiting, but expecting them. Sometimes a destination does not appear when you find it. Sometimes it has been waiting long before you ever arrive. The truck rolled to a slow stop in front of the house, its tires crunching softly over a thin layer of ice as the engine idled in a low, steady hum. And for a moment, none of them moved, as if crossing the distance from road to doorway required more than just a few simple steps. The house stood alone at the edge of the valley, its wooden frame weathered by years of wind and winter, yet the warm glow from its windows gave it a presence that felt less abandoned and more patient, like something that had endured long enough to understand the rhythm of waiting. Daniel turned the key and the engine fell silent, the sudden stillness pressing in around them, broken only by the faint whistle of wind brushing along the roofline and the soft ticking of cooling metal. Rex lifted his head immediately, ears alert, his gaze shifting from the house to the darkness behind them, then back again, as though measuring something unseen between the two. Margaret reached for the door handle with steady hands, but before she opened it, she paused, her fingers resting lightly against the metal, her eyes fixed on the house ahead. "It is still here," she said quietly, not with surprise, but with relief that carried the weight of something long held. Daniel stepped out first, the cold biting sharper now without the shelter of the cab, and he moved around to help her down, his hand firm but gentle as her boots met the ground. The snow here was thinner, swept aside by the wind into uneven patches that revealed worn stone beneath, and as they approached the front steps, the boards creaked softly under their weight, the sound echoing faintly into the quiet night. Rex climbed the steps ahead of them, stopping at the door, his nose lifting slightly as he inhaled the air, his body going still in that familiar way that meant he was listening, truly listening, to something beyond what the world openly offered. The porch light flickered once, briefly, before settling into a steady glow, casting long shadows that stretched across the wood like silent witnesses. Margaret reached into her coat pocket and withdrew a small key, its metal worn smooth from years of use. And as she placed it into the lock, her movements were deliberate, almost ceremonial, as though this act held meaning far beyond simply entering a home. The door opened with a soft creak, and a wave of warmth drifted out to meet them, carrying the scent of cedar and something faintly sweet, like old tea leaves left to steep too long. Inside, the air felt different, not just warmer, but fuller, as if the space itself held memory within its walls. Daniel stepped in after her, his boots leaving faint tracks on the wooden floor, and he paused just inside the doorway, his eyes adjusting to the soft amber light that filled the room. The furniture was simple but carefully arranged, each piece placed with intention, and along the walls hung photographs, their edges worn with time, faces captured in moments that felt distant yet preserved with care. Rex moved slowly through the room, his steps quiet, his head low as he traced an invisible path across the floor, stopping near the center where the wood darkened slightly, his ears lifting as he stared down at a single spot with unwavering focus. Margaret watched him, her expression softening in a way that suggested recognition rather than curiosity, and she nodded almost imperceptibly, as if confirming something she had already known. Daniel followed the dog's gaze, his brow tightening slightly as he took in the subtle difference in the floorboards, the faint outline of something beneath the surface that could easily be overlooked if one did not know where to look. Outside, the wind brushed once more against the house, a low whisper against the walls, and inside, the quiet settled deeper, wrapping around them like a presence that had been waiting, not for anyone, but for the right ones to arrive. Sometimes a place does not reveal itself to those who enter it. Sometimes it waits for those who are meant to see what others never could. Rex did not move from the spot, his body still as stone, ears angled forward with a precision that Daniel had learned never to ignore, and the longer the dog stared at the floor, the more the air in the room seemed to shift, growing heavier in a way that could not be explained by temperature alone. Daniel stepped closer, his boots pressing softly against the wood, and as he lowered his gaze, he noticed the details more clearly now. The faint seam where the boards met slightly uneven, the subtle discoloration that suggested age or use, but also something else, something intentional. Margaret moved past him slowly, her steps measured, and when she reached the center of the room, she did not hesitate. She knelt beside the spot Rex had found, her hand brushing lightly across the surface as though greeting something familiar rather than discovering it. You see it now, she said quietly, her voice calm, certain, and Daniel felt a small tightening in his chest, not from fear, but from the growing sense that he had stepped into something already in motion long before he arrived. He crouched beside her, his fingers tracing the edge of the board until he felt it, a slight give beneath the pressure, and when he pressed more firmly, a soft hollow sound answered back, muted but undeniable. Rex shifted slightly, letting out a low breath, not a warning, but a confirmation, as if the truth beneath the floor had finally been acknowledged. There is something under there, Daniel said, more to himself than to her, and Margaret nodded gently, her eyes never leaving the wood. There has always been, she replied, but it was never meant for just anyone to find. The room fell quiet again, the kind of quiet that carried weight, and Daniel glanced toward the walls, toward the photographs that seemed to watch from their frames, each one holding a piece of a life he did not know, yet somehow felt connected to in a way he could not explain. Then why me? He asked, his voice lower now, stripped of its earlier certainty, and Margaret's expression softened, not with pity, but with understanding. Because you came when you did not have to, she said, her gaze lifting to meet his for the first time since they entered the house. And because he listened when others would not. Her eyes flicked briefly to Rex, who remained steady, his presence grounded and unwavering, and Daniel followed her glance, feeling the familiar sense of trust settle into him, the same trust that had carried him through moments where logic had fallen short. Margaret reached into the pocket of her coat once more, her movements slow, deliberate, and she withdrew a small object wrapped in a faded cloth, its edges worn smooth from years of handling. She held it in her hands for a moment, as though feeling its weight, not in ounces, but in memory, and then she placed it gently into Daniel's palm. The fabric was cool. To the touch, the shape beneath it solid and defined, and when he unfolded it carefully, he revealed an old brass key, its surface etched with faint markings that caught the light in quiet patterns. It was not large, not ornate, but there was something about it that felt significant, as though it belonged to something that had waited a long time to be opened. Daniel looked at it, then back at her, his brow tightening slightly. "What does this open?" he asked, and Margaret's smile returned, soft and knowing, the kind that held more answers than it revealed. "Not just a door," she said, her voice almost a whisper now, as if the house itself was listening, but a promise. Rex lowered himself slowly to the floor beside them, his head resting near the hidden seam, his eyes half closed yet alert, as if guarding something sacred, and outside, the wind passed once more along the walls, a quiet breath against the wood. Daniel closed his fingers around the key, feeling its weight settle into his hand, and for the first time since stepping into the house, he understood that whatever lay beneath them was not simply something hidden, but something meant to be found, not by chance, but by choice. Some doors are locked to keep people out. Others are locked to wait for the right person to finally open them. Daniel turned the key slowly in his hand, feeling the weight of it settle deeper than metal ever should, as if it carried not just purpose, but time, and for a moment he did not move, because something in the stillness of the room suggested that once he did, there would be no returning to the quiet uncertainty he had known before. Rex lifted his head again, his ears angling toward the floor as though something beneath it had shifted in response, a faint awareness passing through him that did not come from sound alone, and his gaze fixed once more on the narrow seam between the boards, steady and unwavering. Margaret rose to her feet with surprising ease, her movements slow but certain, and she stepped back just enough to give Daniel space, her eyes resting on him with a calm that felt almost reassuring, as though she had already seen what he had yet to understand. "It will not open by force," she said gently, her voice carrying through the quiet like a soft echo, "only by intention." Daniel nodded faintly, not because he fully understood, but because something in him recognized the truth in her words, the same instinct that had told him to follow Rex into the woods without hesitation. He reached down, his fingers tracing the seam again until he found a small, nearly invisible notch in the wood, worn smooth by time, yet still present, waiting to be noticed, and when he pressed against it, the board shifted slightly, just enough to reveal a narrow opening beneath. The air that rose from below was cool and dry, carrying a faint scent of earth and cedar, and something else, something older, like a place untouched by the passing of years. Rex stood immediately, stepping closer but not crossing the threshold, his body alert, his tail still, as if he understood that this moment belonged to Daniel alone. With careful movements, Daniel lifted the loose board fully, revealing a small iron latch set into the frame beneath, its surface darkened with age but intact, waiting for the key he now held. His breath slowed as he brought the brass key forward, aligning it with the lock, and for a brief second, he hesitated, not out of fear, but because the quiet around him felt almost sacred, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Then he turned it. The mechanism responded with a soft, deliberate click, a sound that seemed louder than it should have been in the stillness, and the latch released smoothly, as though it had never been stuck, only waiting. The panel beneath the floor shifted slightly, revealing the edge of a hidden door, its outline blending seamlessly with the surrounding wood until now. And when Daniel pulled it open, a narrow staircase descended into darkness, each step worn but steady, leading down into a space the light above could not fully reach. Margaret stepped closer again, her presence quiet beside him, and she looked down into the opening not with curiosity, but with recognition. "It has been waiting," she said softly, "just like you." Daniel glanced at her, then back into the darkness below, the faint outline of the steps drawing his attention forward, and behind him, Rex let out a low breath, not warning, not fear, but something that felt like quiet encouragement. The air from below brushed lightly against Daniel's face, cool and still, carrying with it the sense that whatever lay beneath was not hidden to be forgotten, but preserved to be revealed. He placed one foot onto the first step, testing its strength, and as it held firm beneath his weight, he began to descend, the light from above following him just enough to guide his path, while the shadows below seemed to part slowly, as if welcoming him into something that had been prepared long before he ever knew it existed. Sometimes the answers we search for are not lost. They are simply waiting beneath the surface. For the moment, we are finally ready to step down and meet them. The wooden steps creaked softly beneath Daniel's weight as he descended, each movement slow and deliberate, the dim light from above stretching just far enough to outline the narrow staircase before fading into a deeper shadow below. And with every step, the air grew cooler, stiller, carrying a quiet that felt untouched by the passing world above. He kept one hand against the wall, fingers brushing along the rough surface, grounding himself in something tangible as the unknown opened beneath him. And behind, at the top of the stairs, Rex remained still, watching, his silhouette framed by the warm light above, ears forward, as if guarding the threshold between two worlds. Margaret stood beside the opening, her presence calm and unmoving, her gaze following Daniel not with concern, but with the quiet assurance of someone who had already accepted what would be found. The staircase ended after a dozen steps, opening into a small chamber carved neatly into the earth beneath the house, its walls reinforced with aged timber, each beam placed with careful precision, and though no light source was visible at first, a faint glow lingered within the space, soft and golden, as if it had been waiting patiently for eyes to see it again. Daniel stepped onto the floor, his boots pressing lightly against the packed ground, and he paused, allowing his eyes to adjust, his breath slow and steady as he took in the room before him. It was not large, no more than 10 feet across, yet it felt expansive in a way that had nothing to do with size, because everything within it had purpose. Along one wall stood a narrow wooden table, its surface worn smooth, holding a collection of carefully arranged objects, old but preserved, each placed with intention rather than neglect. There were journals bound in faded leather, their pages slightly curled at the edges, a small oil lamp with a glass chimney that still held a faint trace of soot, and beside it, a framed photograph turned slightly toward the center of the room, as though meant to be seen first. Daniel moved closer, drawn not by curiosity alone, but by something quieter, something that felt like recognition without memory, and when he reached the table, he picked up the photograph gently, careful not to disturb the delicate balance of the space. The image was old, its colors softened by time, but the faces within it remained clear, a younger Margaret standing beside a man with kind eyes, both of them smiling in a way that spoke of a life built slowly and with care, and in the background, the very house above them stood whole and bright beneath a summer sky. Daniel studied it for a moment, then set it back exactly where it had been, his movements instinctively respectful, as if he understood that nothing here was meant to be altered. A soft sound reached him then, barely audible, like the faint ticking of something unseen, and he turned his head slightly, listening, his senses sharpening in the quiet. It was not mechanical, not entirely, but rhythmic, steady, as though something within the room carried its own sense of time, independent from the world above. He followed the sound to the far corner, where a small wooden chest rested against the wall, its surface simple, unadorned, yet unmistakably significant, and as he approached, the faint glow seemed to gather subtly around it, not brighter, but more present, as if acknowledging his attention. The brass key in his hand felt heavier now, its purpose undeniable, and he knelt slowly before the chest, his fingers brushing lightly across its lid, feeling the grain of the wood beneath his touch. For a moment, he hesitated again, not out of doubt, but because something deep within him understood that whatever lay inside would not simply be an object, but an answer, one that might change more than he expected. Above him, the house remained still, the wind whispering softly against its walls, and at the top of the stairs, Rex let out a quiet breath, steady and sure. Daniel placed the key into the lock, his hand firm now, and as he began to turn it, the faint ticking seemed to pause, as if the room itself was waiting for this single moment to unfold. Sometimes the truth does not arrive with noise or force. Sometimes it reveals itself in the quiet, when everything else has finally learned to listen. The key turned with a soft, deliberate motion, and as the final notch settled into place, a quiet click echoed through the small chamber, not loud, but certain, as if something long held had finally been released, and for a moment, everything seemed to pause, the faint ticking fading into silence, the air holding still as Daniel rested his hand on the lid of the chest. He did not rush. Something in the room had already taught him that nothing here responded to urgency, only to presence, and so he lifted the lid slowly, allowing the moment to unfold in its own time. Inside, there was no flash of gold, no overwhelming display of wealth, but something far more unexpected, far more precise. At the center of the chest lay a neatly folded bundle of documents, tied together with a thin strip of faded blue ribbon, the paper beneath aged but carefully preserved, its edges aligned with quiet intention. Beside it rested a small wooden box, no larger than a man's hand, its surface carved with simple patterns that mirrored the faint markings etched into the brass key, and near the edge of the chest, a single envelope sat apart from the rest, its surface marked with one name written in steady, deliberate script. Daniel. He stared at it for a moment, the letters unmistakable, not printed, not generic, but written with the certainty of someone who knew exactly who would one day open this chest, and a slow breath left his lungs as the weight of that realization settled into him. Above, the faint glow in the room seemed to shift slightly, not brighter, but warmer, as if acknowledging that something had finally reached its intended place. He reached for the envelope first, his fingers steady despite the quiet tension building beneath his calm, and as he lifted it, he felt the thickness of the paper inside, not just a note, but something more, something that carried substance. The flap opened easily, the seal long since softened by time, and as he unfolded the letter within, the handwriting matched the name on the front, precise and careful, each line formed with intention rather than haste. He began to read, his eyes moving slowly across the page, and though the words were silent, their presence filled the room in a way that could not be ignored. It spoke not of chance, but of preparation, not of accident, but of design, describing a life spent waiting for the right moment, the right person, someone who would arrive not because they sought reward, but because they responded when it mattered. Daniel's brow tightened slightly as he read, not in confusion, but in recognition, because each line seemed to reflect something he had lived without ever naming, the quiet decisions, the unseen acts, the moments where he had chosen to act when no one was watching. The letter spoke of Margaret, of the house, of what had been placed beneath it, not as a secret to be hidden, but as a gift to be entrusted, something meant to continue, not to end. And when he reached the final lines, his hand paused slightly, his breath catching in a way he did not expect. It ended not with instruction, but with a simple truth, written as if it had always been known. Kindness does not disappear. It returns when the time is right, and when the heart that gave it is ready to receive. Daniel lowered the letter slowly, the words settling into him with a quiet weight that felt both unfamiliar and deeply known. And for the first time since stepping into the house, he did not question why he was here. Behind him, at the top of the stairs, Rex shifted once, a soft movement that carried no urgency, only presence, and above, the house remained still, the wind brushing gently against its walls like a distant echo. Daniel looked back into the chest, his gaze lingering on the remaining items, the documents, the small carved box, each one waiting, not hidden, but offered, and as he reached for them, he understood something he had not fully allowed himself to believe before. Some things are not given because we ask for them. They are given because, somewhere along the way, we have already shown we are ready to carry them. Daniel kept his gaze on the open chest for a long moment, the letter still resting lightly in his hand as if its words had not fully settled yet. And when he finally placed it carefully beside him, his attention shifted to the remaining contents, drawn not by curiosity now, but by a quiet understanding that each piece had been left with intention. He reached first for the bundle of documents tied with the faded blue ribbon, his fingers brushing over the worn paper before gently loosening the knot. And as the pages unfolded, he saw that they were not random records, but carefully organized, each sheet preserved with a precision that spoke of years of preparation. There were property deeds bearing Margaret's name, signatures dated decades apart, records of land extending beyond the visible boundaries of the house, stretching across acres of forest and valley, all maintained, all intact. And as Daniel turned each page slowly, the scope of what had been entrusted here began to take shape, not as sudden wealth, but as something steadier, something built over time and preserved for a purpose that extended beyond ownership. He paused at a final document, its paper newer than the rest, the ink still clear and bold, and as he read it, his breath slowed again, because this one carried his name as well, written in the same steady hand as the letter, transferring not just the house, but everything connected to it into his care, effective immediately, as though the moment he had stepped into this place, the decision had already been completed. Daniel lowered the paper slightly, his eyes lingering on his own name, not with disbelief, but with a growing awareness that this was never meant to surprise him, only to reach him when the time was right. He set the documents aside with the same care he had found them, then turned his attention to the small carved box resting quietly within the chest, its surface smooth beneath his fingers, the patterns etched into it faint but deliberate, echoing the design of the key that had opened everything. He lifted it slowly, feeling its weight, light but present, and when he opened it, the hinge moved without resistance, revealing a single object inside. A compass. Its casing was brass, worn at the edges from years of use, but polished in places where it had been handled most, and the glass face was clear, protecting the needle within, which rested steady for a moment before shifting slightly, as if adjusting to the new presence around it. Daniel held it closer, watching as the needle settled, not pointing north as expected, but angled slightly, as though drawn towards something else, something not marked on any map. He tilted it gently, testing its movement, but the direction remained consistent, unwavering, and a faint crease formed between his brows as he considered what it meant. From above, a soft sound reached him, the subtle shift of wood as Rex moved at the top of the stairs, his presence still anchored to the world above, and yet connected to this one below in a way Daniel was beginning to understand. Margaret's words returned quietly in his mind, not as instruction, but as confirmation, and he closed the compass carefully, holding it in his palm as he looked once more at the contents of the chest. This was not simply an inheritance. It was a continuation, something that required more than acceptance, something that required direction. He stood slowly, the room around him still and watchful, and as he turned toward the stairs, the faint glow seemed to follow him just slightly, as if ensuring he would not lose his way. Sometimes what we are given is not meant to change our lives all at once. Sometimes it is meant to guide us, one step at a time, towards something we were always meant to find. Daniel climbed the stairs slowly, the compass still resting in his hand, its subtle weight grounding him as each step carried him back toward the light above. And when he emerged into the room, the warmth of the house felt different now, no longer just comforting, but aware, as if it recognized that something below had been opened at last. Rex was waiting at the top, exactly where he had remained, his posture steady, his eyes fixed on Daniel the moment he appeared, and without hesitation, the dog stepped forward, lowering his head slightly to sniff the compass before lifting his gaze again, ears twitching as if confirming something only he could sense. Daniel knelt briefly, his hand brushing along Rex's neck, feeling the familiar strength beneath his fur, and for a moment, neither of them moved, the silence between them carrying more understanding than words ever could. When Daniel stood again, Margaret was seated near the window, her posture relaxed, her hands folded gently in her lap as she watched the soft movement of snow outside, and the amber light of the room traced quiet lines across her face, revealing not fatigue, but a calm completion, as though the purpose she had carried for so long had finally reached its end. "You found it," she said softly without turning, her voice certain, and Daniel nodded, though he knew she did not need to see the gesture to understand. He stepped closer, the floorboards creaking faintly beneath his boots, and placed the compass on the table beside her, its brass surface catching the light in a subtle glow. "It points somewhere," he said, his voice thoughtful, not questioning, and Margaret turned her head slightly, her eyes settling on the object with quiet familiarity. "It does not point to a place," she replied. "It points to a path." Daniel considered that, his gaze lingering on the compass as the needle held its steady direction, unmoved by the shifts of the room, and for a brief moment, the old instinct to doubt rose within him, the part that had learned to rely only on what could be measured, but it faded just as quickly, replaced by something steadier, something that had been building since the moment Rex first stopped on that empty road. "And I am supposed to follow it," he said, not as a question, but as a realization, and Margaret's faint smile returned, softer now, touched with a quiet warmth that carried no pressure, only acceptance. "You already have," she said gently. The words settled into the space between them, and Daniel exhaled slowly, the tension he had not fully acknowledged easing just slightly, because somewhere within him, he understood that the path had begun long before he ever held the compass in his hand. Rex moved then, stepping away from Daniel and toward the far side of the room, his nails clicking softly against the wood as he paused near the door, his head lifting once more as if listening, not for danger, but for direction, and his body aligned subtly with the same unseen pull the compass reflected. Daniel watched him, a faint recognition forming as he realized the two were not separate, but connected, two ways of sensing the same quiet truth. Outside, the wind softened, the night settling into a deeper stillness, and inside, the house seemed to breathe with a slow, steady rhythm, as though it had released something it had been holding for years. Margaret leaned back slightly in her chair, her eyes drifting once more toward the window, and though she said nothing further, there was a sense in her presence that nothing more needed to be explained. Daniel picked up the compass again, holding it with a steadier grip now, and as he looked at the needle, unwavering in its direction, he felt something shift within him, not a sudden change, but a quiet alignment, like a piece of himself finally settling into place. Sometimes the moment you understand your path is not when it begins. It is when you realize you have been walking it all along. The night deepened around the house, the kind of stillness that only comes when the world has settled into itself, and inside, the warmth remained steady, wrapping gently around everything it touched, yet something subtle had shifted, something quiet and irreversible. Daniel stood near the window now, the compass still in his hand, its needle unwavering as it pointed toward a direction he could not yet see, and beyond the glass, the snow moved in slow drifting patterns, soft and almost weightless, as if time itself had slowed to match the rhythm of this place. Behind him, the faint creak of wood broke the silence, and when he turned, he saw Margaret rising slowly from her chair, her movements measured but lighter than before, as though something she had carried for years had finally been set down. She walked toward him, each step steady, her presence calm in a way that felt both grounding and distant, and when she stopped beside him, she did not look at the compass or the room, but out into the night. "It will not always be clear," she said softly, her voice blending with the quiet around them. But clarity is not what guides you. It is trust. Daniel listened without speaking, his eyes following the line of the horizon where the darkness met the faint glow of distant sky. And for the first time, he did not feel the need to question what lay ahead. There was no urgency in him, no need to define the path before taking the next step, only a quiet acceptance that whatever came would arrive as it was meant to. Rex moved closer then, his body aligning naturally beside Daniel, his gaze fixed on the same unseen point beyond the window. And for a moment, the three of them stood together in silence, connected not by words, but by something deeper, something that did not need explanation. The house seemed to settle around them, its walls holding the warmth, its presence no longer watchful, but at peace, as though it had fulfilled its purpose. Margaret's hand lifted slightly, resting for a brief moment against Daniel's arm, her touch light but certain, and when he looked at her, there was something different in her expression now, something softer, almost distant, like a reflection beginning to fade at the edges. "You were not brought here to take," she said gently, her eyes meeting his with a quiet sincerity. "You were brought here to continue." The words lingered between them, carrying more meaning than their simplicity suggested, and Daniel felt them settle into him, not as instruction, but as understanding. He nodded slowly, not because he fully knew what that continuation would be, but because something within him recognized it as truth. Outside, the wind passed. Once more across the valley, softer now, like a final breath easing through the trees, and when Daniel turned his gaze back to the window for just a moment, the movement of snow caught his attention, a brief shift in the pattern, and when he looked back again, Margaret had stepped away, returning quietly toward her chair. She lowered herself into it with the same calm grace, her eyes drifting closed not in weariness, but in rest, the kind that follows completion rather than exhaustion. Rex remained still, his ears lowering slightly, not in alarm, but in a quiet acknowledgement, and Daniel stood there for a long moment, the compass steady in his hand, the room wrapped in a silence that felt whole rather than empty. He did not move to disturb her, did not speak, because something told him that this moment was not meant to be interrupted, only understood. The house held its breath once more, not in anticipation, but in peace, and as Daniel stood there, he realized that what had been given to him was not just a place or a path, but a moment that marked the quiet passing of one purpose into another. Sometimes endings do not arrive with sound or sorrow. Sometimes they come gently, like a door closing without a trace, leaving behind only the space for something new to begin. Morning arrived slowly, not with sudden light, but with a gentle shift in the air, the kind that softened the edges of darkness and carried a quiet promise of something new. And Daniel stood where he had been for what felt like hours, the compass still resting in his hand, its steady direction unchanged, its presence no longer unfamiliar but certain. The room held a different silence now, one that felt complete, as if the night had closed around it and left behind only what needed to remain. And when he finally stepped closer to Margaret, there was no urgency in his movement, no need to confirm what he already understood. She sat peacefully in her chair, her expression calm, her hands resting gently in her lap, and there was something in the stillness of her presence that spoke not of absence, but of fulfillment, as though she had simply stepped beyond a threshold that could not be seen. Rex moved quietly beside Daniel, his head lowering slightly, his posture softened in a way that carried no fear, only recognition, and for a moment, the dog remained there, still and respectful, before turning his gaze toward the door once more. Daniel exhaled slowly, a breath that carried both weight and release, and he reached out, adjusting the shawl lightly over Margaret's shoulders, a simple gesture, but one that felt necessary, as if it honored not just her, but everything she had carried to this point. The light outside grew stronger, filtering through the window in pale gold strands that stretched across the wooden floor, touching the photographs on the wall, the table, the place where the hidden door lay beneath, and the house seemed to welcome it, not with change, but with quiet acceptance, with force, but with quiet certainty, and as he walked, the house behind him remained still, its windows catching the morning light, its purpose complete, yet not forgotten. Somewhere beneath it, the chamber remained, holding its memories, its stories, its truth, but above, A new path had already begun to unfold. Daniel did not look back again, not because he wanted to leave it behind, but because he understood that what mattered had already come with him. The wind moved gently across the valley, brushing against him like a quiet companion, and with Rex beside him, step by steady step, he followed the direction set before him, not searching for what was lost, but carrying forward what had been given. He had not been looking for a miracle, but somehow it had found him, not as a sudden change, but as a quiet continuation of everything he had already chosen to be. Sometimes the greatest gift is not what you receive. It is the path you are trusted to walk after.